Good evening, everyone, and Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2011 Civic Scientist Lecture Series, tonight featuring Dr. Jane Lubchenco. I'm George McClendon. I'm the provost, that is the chief academic officer at Rice. My primary responsibility and privilege tonight is simply to welcome those of you from within the Rice community and beyond the Rice community to tonight's extraordinary lecture by an extraordinary scientist whose science is both foundational and plays major roles in our understanding of how to interact with our planet in ways that are sustainable. But my primary responsibility, people ask, what does a provost do? And it's fairly obscure, often even to the provost. Neil can speak to this as a former provost at Rice. But one of the things that one does, as Neil could tell you, is you're the person that introduces the introducer. It comes from serving on the committee on committees. So my distinct pleasure is to introduce Dr. Neil Lane, also civic scientist extraordinaire, who will say something about the Baker Institute series and about tonight's speaker. And since we're running a few minutes late, I will just immediately move then to Dr. Lane. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you very much, George. Good evening, everyone. So I am Neil Lane. I'm a senior fellow. Senior translates into old. We have fellows and we have senior fellows, and while they're not all old, this one is. We're delighted to have you here for this year's Civic Scientist Lecture. It's a very special occasion for us, and certainly a great honor and pleasure to have with us Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who is the administrator for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, as we all know it. Tonight's program is an activity, as George says, of the Baker Institute, and in particular the Institute's Science and Technology Policy Program, which is managed and co-directed by Dr. Kirsten Matthews, who's also a Baker Fellow, just not an old fellow. And I want to thank those who helped make this evening's lecture possible: the White School of Natural Sciences and Dean Dan Carson, the George R. Brown School of Engineering, Dean Ned Thomas, Hammond Foundation, Shell Oil through its distinguished lecture series. The goal of our program, the Science and Technology Policy Program, is to try to bring together scientists and leaders in the business community and other sectors to stimulate discussion about issues of science technology that are particularly important to policy, that are timely, and in many cases that are particularly relevant to Houston and the Gulf Coast regions. We work on such issues as K-12 science and math education, role of women and underrepresented minorities in science and engineering, medical research policy. Much of our focus has been on stem cells, since that's an area in which there is great need for policy attention. We work on the public's understanding of science, but the other side of it, scientists' better understanding of the public and how the public thinks and what the public believes about science. And finally, the integrity of science and policy making, where there have been some difficulties over in previous years, and other issues that influence the future of science technology. We work with other Baker Institute fellows on matters related to energy, space, climate change, healthcare, information technology, national security, and many other important areas of national and international policy. We sponsor speakers, conferences, workshops, write research papers, especially we try to do that with our students, and opinion pieces and other ways, simply try to ensure that policy decisions are informed by the best available scientific and technical information. And one of our special projects, and one that's been dear to my heart since my days in Washington, is the Civic Scientist Lecture Series, which brings to Rice and the Baker Institute leading scientists and engineering researchers who've had a significant impact, positive impact, I might add, on public policy. Indeed, that defines the notion, in my view, of a civic scientist. And in recent years, we've had lectures by Arden Bement, who then was director of NSF, Shirley Ann Jackson, president of RPI, and past chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Bruce Alberts, editor-in-chief of Science Magazine and past president of the National Academy of Science, and Bob Curl of Rice, and Sir Harry Kroto from Florida State, who together with Rick Smalley, you all know, discovered carbon-60, the buckyball molecule, and launched fullerene chemistry, and shared the 1996 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. With these lectures, we're bringing to Rice and Houston community accomplished scientists and engineering researchers who, after successful research careers, discovering new knowledge and new technologies, inventing things, have actually made their way in the policy domain and reaching out to the general public. Just such a civic scientist is tonight's speaker, Dr. Jane Lubchenco. Jane received her PhD, her Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Colorado College, her MS in Zoology from the University of Washington, and a PhD in Ecology from Harvard University, the PhD in 1977. She began her extraordinary career at Oregon State University, which became her academic home. Dr. Lubchenco is an internationally renowned scientist, known especially for her research on marine ecosystems and the impacts of climate change on the environment and humans living in it. She is one of the most highly cited ecologists in the world, and 8 of her publications are recognized as science citation classics. She's an elected member, I have to take a breath, of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Royal Society, and the Academy of Sciences of the Developing World, Europe, and Chile. Dr. Lubchenco has received numerous awards, including the MacArthur Genius Award and 14 honorary doctorates. She was named the 2010 Newsmaker of the Year by the scientific journal Nature, and many of you will remember her photograph graced the cover of Nature magazine in that issue. She served as president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and other professional societies, as well as serving as a member of the National Science Board, where I had the pleasure to work with her. She has also been an influential voice in national policy matters, advising several administrations of both political parties before joining the Obama science team as administrator of NOAA. And Jane is one of the original science team members. The Obama science team, in my view, holds the record, I guess, in terms of depth of scientific understanding of the people appointed, as well as understanding of policy. It's quite an extraordinary science team, and Jane is a charter member of the Obama science team. You'll hear about NOAA from Jane, but let me just say you and I depend on the information that NOAA provides and shares every day of the year, from daily weather forecasts, severe storm warnings, climate monitoring, to fisheries management, coastal restoration, and supporting marine commerce. NOAA's products and services support economic vitality of the nation, and under her leadership, NOAA is trying to improve its delivery of just those services. But in today's political climate, trying to do the right thing, predictably, seems to draw opposition from some members of Congress. That's the extent of my political comments this evening. We're all very fortunate to have someone like Jane at the helm of this important federal agency in such challenging times. The title of her talk is Restoring Science to its Rightful Place, Its Role in America's Future. Please join me in welcoming a true civic scientist, NOAA Administrator, Dr. Jane Lubchenco.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, especially on this chilly day. I wasn't quite prepared for cool weather here. Provost McClendon, thank you for being here, and for a scientist to serve as provost is relatively unusual in the climate of academia of these worlds, and so I really appreciate what you bring to that role. Dr. Lane has been someone I've long admired, having worked with him both in the National Science Board when he was director of the National Science Foundation as the President's Science Advisor, and I've come to really appreciate and value the magnificent job that he has done over the years in bringing science and rationality into politics. And his voice for science and his ability to focus scientists' attention on their responsibilities to communicate with the broader world, to engage with society and listen to society are lessons for all of us, and he has modeled that magnificently. So it's a true honor for me to be here and to pay homage to what he has done and what he stands for, and hold him up as a model for all of us. So thank you, Neil. I appreciate that. Please join me in thanking him and recognizing him. I share his passion and his commitment for both science and engagement with society. And I believe that scientists have a responsibility to share their knowledge broadly with society, but also to serve society. And as Dr. Lane has pointed out, to really listen to what society is interested in, not just what scientists think they should be interested in. In my time with you today, what I'd like to do is share some thoughts about some of the current challenges and opportunities for scientists to do just that, to engage with and serve society. And I'd like to focus on 5 different areas. 1, what is the role of science in democracy? 2, what I call the social contract with science or between science and society. 3, a recent example of science informing decisions made in a crisis, and I'll be referring to the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf. 4, a current example of science informing public understanding of weather and climate, many of the changes that are underway. And then conclude with some of the steps that I believe are necessary to strengthen science and its contribution to society. So with that general roadmap of where I'm headed, let's launch in. The role of science. Many members of Congress and other elected representatives around the world believe that it's important to invest in science, and the kinds of things that they highlight range widely, but they often include things such as improving health and conquering disease, protecting national and homeland security, improving our lives, for example, with new abilities to communicate, weather warnings. One that's often cited is being an engine of economic growth. Something that's often not said publicly but is absolutely important to many is science as a source of national prestige, being the first country to land a person on the moon, or being able to brag about the number of Nobel Prizes. And when I had the privilege of attending the Nobel ceremonies a number of years ago in Stockholm, there was a very avid discussion about what do different nations need to get more of those Nobel Prizes. So it really is a source of national pride. I think there are 2 other very important but less cited roles of science in our society. One is simply satisfying our innate curiosity about the world. That's often not valued, but it's important to recognize, and it really is the source of a lot of people's interest in science. I know from having been at NOAA a number of years how many people are just fascinated by weather. And this even predates the Weather Channel, which has really fed on and satisfied some of that curiosity. But I meet young kids that are just following the weather all the time, and it's an entry. It's because they're curious about the world, and it's an entry point for them into science. The second role of science that is underappreciated, I believe, is science to inform our understanding and decisions. And I say inform deliberately, because I don't believe that science should dictate what society should do. It shouldn't dictate a particular outcome. But if science is at the table, it will make decisions better decisions. I use science, not dictate, because I fully appreciate that when people make decisions, whether it's individuals or institutions, that they will take into account a number of different things. Politicians will take into account economics, politics, values, but I believe that science should also be at the table. Science to inform those decisions. And if the science is not understandable, if it's not credible, if it's not relevant to the decision they're making, it won't be at the table. And so part of the responsibility that I believe scientists have is to make the science that they have and that they know understandable, relevant, usable, so that it can be used to make decisions, but also credible. It needs to be legitimate, and it needs to be salient. And that's not always an easy suite of things to achieve. Science to inform our decisions. Now, what does inform really mean? It means, to me, understanding, for example, how the world works and how it's changing. But beyond that, what are the likely consequences of different policy options, given our best understanding about how the world works or how a particular system works, and what changes are underway? What do we think are the likely consequences of different options? And part of that informing also, to me, entails helping to come up with solutions, to provide alternative pathways forward. So I consider all that part of science to inform. And I believe that science to inform should be more acknowledged and more accepted. The role of scientists in this is to, I believe, help share their science more broadly. The culture of academia has been such that it has placed a very high premium on scientists communicating with other scientists through peer-reviewed publications, through participation in scientific meetings, and more recently and importantly, teaching. But the academic community has not traditionally valued scientists being public, scientists communicating with the public. Now, yes, public affairs offices will want scientists to do that, but the academic scientific community doesn't, by and large, value scientists doing that. This is changing, and it's changing in a good way. But I believe that scientists have an obligation to share their knowledge, not just with one another, but with the public, with industry, with the variety of users who should be interested in what they're doing. But to do so effectively, scientists need to be trained to do that. And so the challenge, I believe, to the academic community is not only to encourage scientists and value scientists doing this, reward them for doing it, or at least take away the disincentives, but also to provide training to help them do a better job. I've been involved in establishing a training program for academic mid-career environmental scientists called the Leopold Leadership Program. And when we began the program a number of years ago, we were concerned that scientists might not even apply to be trained. Luckily, our fears were unfounded, and stellar, absolutely spectacular scientists have applied and been trained by this program. Pedro Alvarez, who is a member of your faculty here, is one of the Leopold Leadership Fellows, and he joined the ranks of a number of very distinguished scientists who have been through that training. So I have seen from firsthand experience that scientists are willing and able and ready to step out into this broader world, but the academic community needs to support their doing so. In addition to that, I believe that scientists, as part of this contract with society, have an obligation to not only pursue push the boundaries, intellectual frontiers of knowledge in what is often called curiosity-driven science, such as what NSF supports, but also to do the kind of science that is immediately relevant to solving societal problems, but for which there is also a cutting-edge dimension. And let me say that differently. I believe that the construct that I was told when I was a young scientist was you had to choose between doing basic science and applied science. And I actually think that that is an outdated way of looking at the world, that there is a third option that's in the middle that Lou Branscombe calls Jeffersonian science, that is science that is relevant to societal problems, relevant to societal issues, but is also cutting-edge science. And this Jeffersonian science is the kind of science that we do at NOAA. It's the kind of science that I have championed more academic scientists doing, to really be engaged in tackling some of the big problems, not just what is interesting intellectually, but what can satisfy that is interesting intellectually and be helpful to society. And this contract with society, I believe, then has multiple dimensions, one of which is to support that full range of basic, applied, but Jeffersonian science, and secondly, to share what we know much more broadly. Changing the culture of academia, supporting not only faculty learning to communicate more broadly, but students learning to do that as well, I think is something that is appropriate for institutions to be tackling. There are a lot of things that we have learned from the from the Leopold Leadership Program about how to communicate effectively, and I'm happy to share some of those ideas with anyone who is interested. But one of them is really acknowledging that communication is two-way, and that it's not just talking, it's also being able to listen. Scientists need to become bilingual. They need to learn the language of science that is very technical. It's got lots of jargon. But they also need to be able to translate that into English, into language that lay people can understand. And doing that translation is not always easy, because the technical terms, the jargon, the constructs are very precise, and a lot of that nuance is really important. And to be able to translate that, to simplify that into something that is understandable and yet accurate, is a very real challenge. And that's part of what we do in the training, for example, for the Leopold Leadership Program, is help scientists figure out how to tell their stories in ways that are accessible and interesting and memorable. We like sticky stories, things that people will remember, but to do so in a way that is accurate. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it is possible. Scientists feel very uneasy telling stories, and to be able to share information in stories and use analogies where appropriate, and even demonstrations is, I think, very much in the mode of communication. So the role of scientists, I believe, and the role of science are evolving and changing. And I would highlight the social contract for science, with the real world being the cutting edge, and the opportunities for us to be pushing boundaries of knowledge, but also helping society. And I would highlight the chemistry of the stratosphere as an example of Jeffersonian science. Complex dynamics inside of hurricanes or tornadoes, the biodiversity needed to provide ecosystem resilience, and the continued provision of ecosystem services in a changing environment. There's so many rich areas that are really pushing the boundaries of knowledge, but are relevant to societal problems, and we need to connect those dots more. I believe that this kind of science is not sufficiently appreciated and is oftentimes falls between the cracks. And it is the science, the kind of science that we do at NOAA, but our research budgets at NOAA are very small and are not commonly appreciated for being as important as I believe we are. I want to give you two quick examples that show the essential role of this Jeffersonian science in society. And I want to start with using science in a crisis, specifically the Deepwater Horizon event and the aftermath having to do with restoration. Science guided the response to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in a way that was very effective in terms of the decision-making process. But in fact, the public was often confused, and there was this real disconnect between the science that was informing decisions and the science that was communicated more broadly, and I think there's some lessons to be learned from that. As you all will recall, April 20th, which by the way was Earth Day, and the 40th anniversary of Earth Day, and those of you who are old enough to remember the founding of Earth Day will recall that it was prompted in part by the Santa Barbara oil spill. So this is a very interesting historic irony. April 20th, 2010, the nation was catapulted into the largest marine oil spill in our history. Within hours of the initial spill, the initial explosion, we needed to know where the oil was and where it was going and what might be in harm's way. In those same very early hours, NOAA began pumping out scientific information needed for a smart tactical response. You might ask, why NOAA? Well, by law, NOAA is the nation's lead science agency for oil spills in marine and coastal environments. Every year, NOAA responds to on the order of at least about 150 oil spills. Thankfully, most not the magnitude that Deepwater Horizon was. Our role in the Deepwater Horizon event was fivefold. 1, to conduct and share science. 2, to keep seafood safe. 3, to protect wildlife and habitat. 4, to help assess the damage. And 5, to have science guide the restoration effort. Let me say a little bit about each of those just briefly. Conducting and sharing the science. A lot of the information that we had about where is the oil, where is it going, was needed to inform placement of booms or skimming, burning. Hours after the initial explosion, the newly constituted Unified Command in Robert, Louisiana, had at its fingertips a trajectory forecast showing where the oil would be headed should it appear from the explosion. We didn't really know what was going to be coming out, but we knew where it would go based on oceanographic models and weather information at the time. Less than 20 hours later, the first spot weather forecast that focused just right on the area that was relevant was issued by our Weather Forecast Office in Slidell, Louisiana, at the request of the Unified Command. These specialized forecasts consider time, topography, and weather and provide much more detailed, more timely, and specific information than the regular regional forecasts that we issued. NOAA set up its war room in Seattle to run oceanographic and atmospheric models day after day after day, using the latest information from satellites, from planes, from buoys and ships and gliders, so the full suite of platforms, to initialize the models and then predict the patterns of movement. And they were incredibly dynamic. It was not just A to B. It was, I've seen animations of where the oil went, and it was just so dynamic, it was amazing. Day after day, the National Weather Service meteorologists produced these spot weather forecasts, over some 4,000 total produced. So these very basic workhorses, scientific tools, gave us vital information that informed a lot of the activity during the spill. Our second responsibility, keeping seafood safe. Scientific information told us which fisheries might have to be closed based on information about how hydrocarbons interact with different types of creatures. Finfish, shellfish have very different responses, need to be treated differently. NOAA closed fisheries as the first line of defense to preventing contaminated seafood from entering the marketplace. Scientific information, the location of the oil, and the forecast to show us where it was expected to be guided the determination of where areas would be closed. And then information about how to test for contamination. We designed a whole new sampling protocol with the states and with the Food and Drug Administration that has the actual responsibility for certifying seafood safety. And so we developed protocols to ensure that contaminated seafood did not get into the marketplace and would only reopen closed areas when they had been sampled repeatedly, and with information that they had that seafood was safe. Finfish process hydrocarbons and they metabolize them so it doesn't accumulate. So that was a lot more straightforward than oysters, for example, that once they're contaminated, that contamination remains. Like the closures, the opening of these areas depended on good science. And this protocol is actually now, I think, recognized as being a very rigorous protocol that was done in real time in response to a crisis, but with the kinds of checks and balances that we needed. We also had to develop some new methodologies. It was pretty obvious how to test for contamination by hydrocarbons, but nobody had developed a test for dispersants or dispersed hydrocarbons. And so we had to do some new science to actually develop the new tests and then be able to utilize them. Third general category, protecting wildlife and habitat. We conducted overflights almost daily to monitor marine mammals, turtles, specific fisheries, wetlands, and marshes to know what was going on, where they were. NOAA research ships initiated ongoing investigations of the potential impacts of the oil on marine mammals and fish and turtles. And we collaborated closely with the Department of Interior, who shares responsibility with us for sea turtles, in moving nests of many sea turtles that we thought were going to be in harm's way to get them out of harm's way. We collaborated with a lot of fishermen and a lot of local citizens to go out and actually captured oil turtles, bring them back, rehab them, and only when conditions were safe, i.e. most of the oil was gone, did we put them back out. So again, scientific knowledge of turtle physiology, ecology, and behavior guided these activities, helping us know where to look for animals affected by the spill, assess their vulnerabilities. A lot of that work is ongoing. Most of the turtles that were rehabbed have been released, but one of the big puzzles now remains with the dolphins. We've had what's called an unusual mortality event. The government is full of acronyms. We have a UME, unusual mortality event, that simply says lots of them are dying, we don't know why, and we have a lot of veterinarians that are looking into what the causes are. So immediately after the spill, dead dolphins, but quite a few since then, even after most of the oil has been consumed by bacteria. And we've had a large number of neonates that have been found dead. And the cause of that is still unknown. There have been a number of dolphins that have been found with the bacterium called brucellosis. That seems to be the immediate cause of death of some of them, but to the extent to which their immune systems may have been compromised and then they were more susceptible to that or not, we don't know. So there's still some puzzles that are out there. Fourth general category had to do with assessing the damage, and then this folds into the restoration that's appropriate given the damage that was done. There's an ongoing process called the Natural Resource Damage Assessment that is a formal legal process that is determined or is intended to evaluate the damage that was done to natural resources and the public's loss of those natural resources. So this is completely separate from the claims process that Ken Feinberg is operating. That's individuals that are filing for damages. This natural resource damage assessment process focuses on the loss, the damage to natural resources. So fisheries, seabirds, turtles, wildlife, habitats, and the public's access to them. So whether you can go fishing recreationally or go bird watching. If there were things that were killed and you lose access to them, that's part of this process. There's a very rigorous process that's underway to evaluate the impact of the spill. Much of that is not in the public domain in terms of what we're finding, because the whole idea of the natural resource damage assessment process is to build the strongest possible court case against the responsible parties so that there can be an agreement about the responsible parties funding the restoration efforts. And in a court case or in a pre-settlement, you don't want to tip your hand. And so much of the information that is in hand now, and it's quite extensive about the full impact, is still under wraps. So stay tuned for that. A lot of the information that has come out from academic scientists that are working on assessing the damage is in the public domain, but that's only a subset of what the full story will eventually tell. That assessment of the damage then will fold into, okay, now how do we fix the damage that was done? And that process is part of this natural resource damage assessment process. It's overseen by a trustee council, the Natural Resource Damage Trustee Council, which has 3 federal trustees, NOAA, Department of Interior, Department of Defense, and 5 state trustees. So all 5 of the Gulf Coast states and the 3 federal trustees make up this trustee council, and they are in the process of doing their assessment of the damage and decisions about the restoration. All of that has to be with public input, and so there is a public process that is involved in the decision-making about the restoration. I encourage anybody interested to get involved in that. The restoration effort, I think, will be ongoing, will take many, many, many years to fully recover damage. And as you're all well aware, there were threats to the Gulf ecosystem well before the oil spill. And that broader view of how do we bring the entire Gulf ecosystem back to a healthy state, recognizing not only the spill, but the other changes to the Gulf region, is part of a larger commitment that President Obama made when he set out and appointed the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force that released its strategy document yesterday at the State of the Gulf Summit that's happening in town here. That strategy document will guide the broader thinking about restoration efforts, but I would note that there is no immediate pot of money available to do that restoration, that broader restoration. The only money that will happen is that is guaranteed is what comes from the natural resource damage assessment legal case or settlement thereof. You may be aware that there has been legislation introduced called the Restore Act that would divert 80% of the Clean Water Act penalties from the spill into a fund for restoration. Apart from all the legal and political aspects, I want to just emphasize how important it is that science be informing the restoration effort, and that's part of one of our roles in this process, is to make sure that happens. I want to segue now from Deepwater Horizon using science in a crisis. Actually, I do want to say something else before I do that. I can tell you from having been on the inside of the crisis and meeting on a daily basis with the other principals, which included Carol Browner in the White House, Thad Allen as the incident commander, Administrator Jackson of EPA, Ken Salazar, Secretary of the Interior, Janet Napolitano, the Secretary of Homeland Security. We met on a daily basis and made decisions about the spill, and I can tell you that science was at the table and played a key role. The public perception of what was happening was not quite what was actually happening, and there was a lot of public confusion about what did we know, what did we not know. And I think there are many lessons to be learned from that, one of which is that the cacophony of voices makes it very difficult to sort of penetrate. Lots of people had different agendas, and there was a general lack of background information. So getting information that was scientifically accurate from the media didn't happen very well. A lot of the coverage was relatively inaccurate. And I think it underscores the importance of just having better background understanding of things before a crisis. It just makes it that much harder. And as someone said after the fact, when we were talking about working with partners during a crisis, that a crisis is not a time to start exchanging business cards. Well, that's absolutely the case. The relationships that existed before the crisis enabled people to work together. The same is true for communicating information to the public. To the extent that we can and should have done a better job of having the public have a better understanding of what the issues were, we might not have been in the challenging situation we were. The other quick thing that I would note is that the federal government went to extraordinary efforts to convene daily meetings with a lot of different interested parties. We met daily conference calls with the governors, with many of the parish presidents, with members of Congress, with the media. We didn't have a mechanism for communicating scientific information to scientists on a regular basis. The only way scientists in the Gulf region or elsewhere got their information was through the media. And so one of the lessons learned to me is that we need to figure out better ways of giving scientists access to scientific information without having to go through intermediaries that aren't going to understand it or want to cover it or whatever. So a lot of interesting lessons learned from that. I want to segue now to using science to inform public understanding of changes in weather and climate, which is an ongoing issue for us. In this example, it really shows, I think, how science underpins the services that we at NOAA provide to the American public. You're all familiar with the weather forecasts and disaster warnings that we provide about weather. You take advantage of those, I assume. And people have come to just sort of assume they happen and don't necessarily always know what goes into them. Much of the research that we do is designed to improve the quality of those and to make them better and better, and that, in fact, has happened in a remarkable way through time. Our weather forecast disaster warnings have gotten better and better. They can be better still, and we will continue to go down that path. But as we are seeing more and more extreme events, we are increasingly challenged to communicate not just the short-term weather events, but the longer term, what can we expect down the road, given that we are seeing changes in the frequency and intensity of many extreme events. We talk about weather services at NOAA as information that's on the scale of hours to days. And we talk about climate services as anything that's longer than 14 days, because our weather models don't really work beyond that. And so climate services are information about something longer than 14 days. So if we give you a heads up that there's going to be a severe drought or there's going to be flooding months down the road, that's a climate service. And we at NOAA are tracking changes in not just patterns of weather, but patterns of some of these longer term events. And I can tell you that this year is definitely one for the record books in terms of extreme weather events. We have seen an unprecedented number of tornadoes, floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires. One of the things that NOAA tracks are the number of events that total at least $1 billion in damage. The previous record for the number of at least $1 billion events was set in 2008. There were 9 events in 2008. This year we are up to 10 and still counting. So this will go down in the record books as a year of unprecedented extremes. Based on information that was released just recently by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, we are told that this is not just an anomaly, that we should expect more extreme events, especially ones that are droughts and floods and very, very extreme precipitation events. Great big huge snowstorms, great big huge storms that drop lots and lots and lots of rain. And so it's increasingly important that people have access to that kind of information, which is why we at NOAA were proposing to not just provide information about weather services and climate services, but to organize in a way that would be more effective to provide those climate services about the things that are happening that people are asking for more and more information about. For political reasons, we were unable to do that internal reorganization, budget neutral, within NOAA to make the provision of climate services more effective because it had the word climate in it, and so it got caught up with a lot of the politicization of the climate topic that is characteristic of a lot of the discussions that are happening in Washington these days. So I think that's a disservice to the American public, but one that we need to work even harder to talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it's relevant and useful. So our role, we have responsibilities for weather, climate, oceans, and coasts. And I've talked about science underpinning the provision of services. We also have science that underpins our stewardship responsibility. Both of those came together in the Deepwater Horizon, but this event with climate and weather extremes is an example of the service component. The role that we play is very much dependent on science, and I can tell you that as budgets in federal agencies are experiencing very intense downward pressures, it is becoming more and more challenging to continue to fund this Jeffersonian science that I believe is so important to enable us to do a better job of improving our forecasts and disaster warnings. We had a 10-year project a number of years ago that significantly improved our ability to predict where hurricanes are going to go. And if you saw the forecast for Hurricane Irene, it was spot on. Quite a few days, 5 days out, we predicted exactly where Irene would go, and it was spot on. What we haven't been able to do is a better job of predicting the intensity of the hurricane, not just the track. And we have initiated we're actually in the third year of a 10-year program to get a better understanding of the very complex dynamics inside hurricanes that would enable us to do a better job with intensity. That is at great risk right now with the downward pressure on our budgets. And it's one example of the many kinds of research programs that we are going to be increasingly challenged to continue. So I think the message here is partly that the kinds of services and stewardship and science that I'm talking about here at NOAA is using your tax dollars. And I believe that what we do at NOAA is one of the best bargains for the American people. It costs each American less than 5 cents a day, less than a nickel a day, to provide the full range of services that NOAA provides. And I think it's a pretty darn good deal. I can tell you that we are having big challenges as we look ahead. That's true of all federal agencies. There's some very, very challenging trade-off discussions that will be happening. The other point that I would make with respect to that is that a lot of the basic core information we provides a platform for the private sector to grow new businesses. And we've certainly seen that in the weather service enterprise. There is now an entire billion-dollar public weather enterprise that has grown private weather enterprise that has grown up around weather services. So NOAA provides core information, private sector, AccuWeather, Weather Channel, provide value added, and then share that, market it, sell it, whatever their business plan is. We believe that there's a comparable opportunity for the private sector in the provision of climate services based on the core information that NOAA provides today. So there is a really interesting stimulation of the economy opportunity in just the provision of the services. So I've given you 2 extended examples of the role of science in producing science and services that I think have great value to the nation. I want to touch just very briefly on what we are doing to protect the integrity of science at NOAA. It would obviously be a major disservice to the American people for scientific information that we provide to be distorted or suppressed. And on March 9th, President Obama issued a memorandum that directed all the federal agencies to abide by certain principles and guidelines that he laid out and to develop policy that would guarantee that scientific integrity be protected within each agency. At NOAA, we've had a very extensive, intensive, deliberate, inclusive process to develop a scientific integrity policy, and I'm pleased to say that we will be rolling it out tomorrow. And I think it is a model for all agencies, one that I think will serve us well in the future. and that will enable us to strengthen the science that we do, to show how much we value science, but to also be clear about sharing it, providing and shining a light on what is the science that goes into making decisions, and having opportunities to make sure that the science is not distorted or changed or suppressed in some way. I believe that scientific integrity is really at the core of conducting ethical science, and by being open and honest about our science, we can build understanding and trust. And what we really want is for people who use our information to trust it and to trust the process that developed it. And so by freely and honestly sharing the information, we can invite open discussion about the process, about the evidence, about the interpretations, and its application to policy and practice. We all know that scientific information or science is not just a body of facts and figures, it's a process, and that information grows and changes. And so the policy acknowledges that and enables that. So free and open inquiry is really the backbone of science, and it's the backbone of democracy. When we stand up for scientific integrity, I think we stand up for democracy. And this is what I think about when I think of what is the rightful place of science. I'm committed to seeing that we at NOAA execute this policy that we're very proud of, and have it be one that is durable because it has ownership within the agency. It really is not something that I imposed on the agency. It's something that has grown from within. I believe passionately that science is not and should not be partisan, and that is the way we think and talk about our science, and that science should be available to inform all of the decisions. So you've been very patient. I've talked about a number of different things, starting with an homage to Neil Lane and the concept of civic scientist, with a big thank you to you. I talked about the role of science and the underappreciated role of informing the way we think about and understand our world and make decisions. I talked about the role of scientists and the social contract with science, the importance of communicating and being relevant. I talked about using science to inform action in a crisis, and some of what worked and what didn't work in the Deepwater Horizon. I talked a little bit about using science to inform our understanding of weather and climate changes, with a lot of work to be done on that front. And then finally, protecting science and democracy through scientific integrity, making sure we have good checks and balances. My final point really concerns ensuring a vibrant scientific enterprise for America's future. I believe that strong science is really essential to democracy, and we need to do everything we can to strengthen and protect the scientific enterprise, but to also ensure that science is listening to society and is cognizant of the interests, desires of citizens, and that there is a robust dialogue to make sure that the science that we do is open and transparent, and that there is confidence in our science because there's confidence in the process. To ensure that science is not misused, distorted, or altered in making policy. And I believe we need to do a better job of engaging citizens in the process of science, regardless of who is doing that. It also means having citizens who can use scientific information to make decisions. So science gives us lots of powerful tools and services. It opens doors, new horizons. It provides us with the means to respond to oil spills, or the knowledge information to conserve and manage our oceans and coasts. Scientific information, I see, saves lives every day. And there is growing need for more of this information as our world becomes even more dynamic. But science is being undermined on multiple fronts. There are increasing challenges to science, not just the funding of science, but the use of science. There's a strong current of anti-rationality that really is counter to democracy. And in many cases, science is not valued. I put that squarely on the shoulders of scientists to do a better job of being humble, of communicating, of listening. But it's also a broader issue than one just to the scientific community. It's also one that is a societal dialogue that we need to be having. And so events like this dialogue, this civic scientist series, and the discussions you have in the Baker Institute are very much the kind of thing that we should be engaged in on a routine basis. I believe that what we at NOAA do is of great service to the nation, but we continually remind ourselves that we serve the American people and that we need to be listening to them and responsive to their needs. This is a collective challenge for all of us, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity to share these thoughts with you about science and democracy, where we're headed, where we've been. I think there are rich, rich opportunities, but this is not just one for a few people to sit around thinking about. This is really a societal-wide discussion that we need to be having. So thank you for the opportunity. And thank you all for your attention. I'd be delighted to have questions and engage in some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. We do have time for a few questions, and then we'll have a reception, and you can bring the other questions down and have a chat with our distinguished lecturer. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, and congratulations on dealing, which is a very, very difficult issue, and that's getting a policy that works for an agency on integrity of science. It's not as straightforward as some of us maybe assumed a year or so ago, because of course the scientists must be honest and forthcoming and open in what they're doing. But when they're working for a federal agency, an agency that has all kinds of policy positions on matters that affect the people and affect business and industry and so forth, there's a balance that has to be struck. It's a very difficult one, I think, and having read at least an earlier version of this policy, I think it perhaps is a model for other agencies to follow. So congratulations on that. Are there questions? And I thought Richard would have a question. And let me just remind everybody that really does need to be a question. So at the end of whatever your short comment is, please put a question mark. Richard.
First of all, I echo Neil. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Okay. So after this talk, I'm going to go home, and my wife's going to ask me what to talk, and she knows no science whatsoever. Okay? And I'm going to tell her this is going to be a record year of extremes. We've already had the droughts. We've got all kinds of things in our house. And she's going to say, why? Jane, what do I tell her?
I think the pattern that I described is a record number of at least $1 billion events. Okay? I think that there are probably 4 things that are affecting that pattern. One is there are increases in extreme events themselves. We're seeing more extreme events. But the record number, which is now up to about 52 billion and counting, also reflects there are more people in harm's way with more stuff in harm's way. So more people in harm's way, for example, in coastal areas. People have more stuff that costs more. So that bumps up the number. And more people have insurance for more of that stuff. So you put all those together and you get an increased number of billion-dollar events. Now, if you just look at the record for the number of extreme events, there is no doubt that that is going up as well. And you may well ask, why is that? And we can connect the dots in a very substantial way between climate change and a subset of those extreme events, specifically droughts, floods, great big huge large storms that drop lots of snow or rain. It is more challenging to ascribe causality to tornadoes, small-scale events, tornadoes, and thunderstorms. So there's still less certainty. We think that the large-scale climate change patterns probably affect those small-scale events, but exactly the nature and the direction of that influence are not completely there. So short answer is increase in extreme events. Many of them are the ones that are likely affected by climate change, but we're seeing also increase. April was an all-time record for the number of tornadoes, 814 tornadoes in April alone. The connection with climate change there is uncertain.
So she will ask, are we doing something wrong? Are we?
We're not paying attention to what nature is telling us.
Take another question, and then we'll go up here.
Do the figures for the billion-dollar events take inflation into account?
Yes.
Can you hear?
So the question is, did the calculations for the billion-dollar events take inflation into account? The raw numbers are not corrected, but the patterns are the same if you correct them. Good question.
One back here, and then we'll come out front.
I just came over from the other conference, and I think we would agree that we need to use ecosystem-based management on the Gulf of Mexico, from the estuaries on the Texas coast to the estuaries on the Cuban coast. How do you do that in the context of national and state sovereignty?
Did everybody understand the question? I mean, hear the question?
Please do repeat.
The State of the Gulf Summit that is happening across town is focused very much on ecosystem-based approaches to restoration. And the question is, how do you do that in the context of national and international boundaries? You know, there are Cuban waters, there are Mexican waters, there are U.S. waters in the Gulf. There is strong collaboration across the U.S. and Mexico around the concept of the large marine ecosystem that is ecosystem-based. So we have a rich dialogue and research collaborations underway with Mexico on this very concept. With Cuba, the situation is slightly different. However, during the Deepwater Horizon event, we routinely updated our Cuban colleagues on what was happening because it had the potential to affect their shores. And when there was great uncertainty about how the loop current, which is a current of warm water that flows, so if this is the Yucatan Peninsula, this is Cuba, there's a current of warm water that comes up into the Gulf, loops around, and then goes out through the Florida Strait into the Gulf Stream. And in its full loopy configuration, it had the potential to entrain oil, bring it down to the Florida Keys and Cuba, and then possibly up the East Coast. And so there was a lot of uncertainty about where is this loop current now? What does it look like, not just on the surface, which we can image from satellites, but what does it look like below the surface, because there was this plume of dispersed oil underneath the surface. And we reached out to our Cuban colleagues and said, we have a research vessel that needs to go into your waters to fully appreciate and understand this. May we have permission? Normally, the Cubans would require a research vessel like NOAA's to come into Havana, get a Cuban scientist on board and a bunch of handlers as well, and to go out and monitor everything. They just said, go for it. No requirements, no nothing. So the dialogue in a crisis like that, because we had good scientific collaboration and because I mentioned before the importance of pre-existing relationships, we routinely provide Cuba with information about hurricanes and major weather phenomena. So we have that, we had those connections, we built on those. So I believe it is quite possible to do ecosystem-based management in international waters and national waters, and that's the way we should be doing it. And fortunately, at this conference, there were representatives from at least Mexico. I don't know if there were any Cubans that were present.
Provost McClendon.
This is actually a follow-up to both of those questions. That when you talk about restoring the Gulf, restoring it to something is sort of I'd like to know a little bit about how one thinks about that process, because what the Gulf was in 1800 sort of bears not much resemblance to what it was in 1900,
Right.
and almost no resemblance to what it was in 2000. So what your baseline is, and what you imagine these fairly rapid climactic modulations will be. How, when you start this large process, I'm sure there's low-hanging fruit you can figure out right away. But then lots of other things seem like trade-offs. It might be lovely to have barrier wetlands, but you're not going to get those back in a simple way. So can you tell us how when you and your colleagues think about those processes, how do you build in the inevitability of some things seeming irreversible?
You are highlighting some really great challenges and ones that present a lot of trade-offs. I don't think any restoration ecologists today think about restoring something to a past state. First of all, it's probably not possible, but it really is not even, it's not productive. The focus today is squarely on restoring it to a healthy state where it can provide a suite of what we call ecosystem services. Most ecosystems provide a wealth of benefits to people. The provision of seafood, detoxification of pollutants, wildlife for people to enjoy or recreational opportunities, recycling of nutrients, carbon sequestration are some of the examples of benefits that are provided by coastal and ocean ecosystems. Those benefits are provided by the interactions of the plants and animals and microbes in the system. And restoration is now appreciated as being a process to restore a system to a state where basic ecological processes are working, and to have the system be resilient to changes, whether it's climate change or introduction of invasives or another oil spill. And so the focus is not on restoring it to a state, but restoring it to ecological processes that enable the provision of ecosystem services and that are resilient to changes that might come along. Now, how you actually do that is getting down in the weeds, but that's the concept.
So you're creating a steady state in essence. Some sort of dynamic.
Except that it's not an equilibrial state.
No, not equilibrium state.
It is a resilient state that can have, for example, enough biodiversity is really critical here because within a group of species that do something similar, there are some differences among them. Some might do better under a more acidic ocean, as we have ocean acidification. Some might do better under a warmer ocean. Some might do better at dealing with invasive species. And so to have the full complement of biodiversity helps enable resilience in an uncertain time. And so a lot of people, as they're thinking not just about restoration, but about adaptation to climate change, are focused more on this concept of resilience and biodiversity to enable resilience with an uncertain future.
We'll take about three.
Actually, I came in with one, and I've ended up with three issues I'd love to hear you talk about. One addresses Richard's question, if he wants to stay in here. But it occurred to me that another thing you could list or connect the dots with about climate change and disasters are or forest fires through the drought and
Yes.
disease
Correct.
infestation.
That's absolutely correct.
You might want to add that to his answers.
Yep, nope. Point taken.
The other one is, I'm concerned by what I've read about us losing our eyes in the skies and the
Yes.
information that we need to understand the weather forecasting issue, and I'd like for you to address that. The third one is that I read some years ago about the creation of a National Climate Service under your organization, among whose responsibilities would be the economic calculations when it is appropriate to abandon coastal cities and ports. And I think I heard you say that has been dropped from political pushback, and so if you speak more to that and what you would like to create if you could.
Okay. So let's start with the satellites and then do the climate service. Satellites that NOAA's, so a number of agencies have satellites. NASA's role with their satellites is to explore space, to push the boundaries of knowledge, understanding the cosmos. And they have a very small, about 5% of their budget is Earth observations. Those Earth observations are mostly developing new instruments. Once those instruments are perfected, there's a handoff from NASA to NOAA. Our job is to fly the operational satellites that give us routine observations about Earth. The weather satellites there are vitally important. NOAA is the only agency that is responsible for operational civilian weather satellites. And those satellites provide over 90% of the data that go into our numerical weather models. So just the daily forecast, 90% of the information comes